Unaware of his mother-in-law's $18 million, he insulted her, so she left it all to the maid. What started as a cruel remark at a family dinner explodes into a storm of betrayal, hidden secrets, and shocking truths. A faithful maid, a child with an innocent whisper, and a family torn apart by pride all collide in a fight over fortune and forgiveness. But behind the money lies something far greater. The question of who truly deserves love, loyalty, and legacy. When the truth finally comes to light, will greed destroy everything, or will compassion build a family stronger than gold? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Sunlight spilled through the lace curtains of Eleanor Whitmore's bedroom, casting delicate patterns across the antique oak dresser. She sat on the edge of her bed, thumbing through her devotional book with weathered hands. The old mansion creaked and sighed around her like a living thing, its polished banisters and crown molding telling stories of generations past. Eleanor turned the page and smiled at the underlined verse. The Lord sees, not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. She closed the book gently, tucking it beside her bed. Few people knew that beneath Eleanor's modest appearance and simple habits lay a fortune of $18 million inheritance from her late husband's business empire. Eleanor had never seen the need to flaunt wealth when kindness cost nothing. Downstairs, Maria Lopez hummed softly as she dusted the living room furniture. For 30 years, she had kept Eleanor's home spotless, her dedication extending far beyond employer and employee. The framed photos on the mantelpiece gleamed as she wiped each one with care. Eleanor's wedding portrait, Margaret's graduation, and newer editions of a dark-eyed boy with a mischievous smile. "Mommy, I finished my homework." Gabriel burst into the room, waving a sheet of paper. At 8 years old, he was all energy and curiosity, with a smile that could light up the darkest corners of the old house. Maria set down her dusting cloth. "Let me see, Mijo." Gabriel proudly displayed his math problems, solved with careful numbers and only 2 erasure marks. "Excelente!" Maria kissed the top of his head. "Now, remember to be quiet. Miss Eleanor is having her morning reading. Can I go see if she's done?" Gabriel hopped from one foot to the other. She promised to show me pictures of the birds that visit her garden. "First, help me carry these tea things to the kitchen." The telephone rang just as they finished stacking the cups. Maria answered, her voice shifting to the more formal tone she used for Eleanor's family. "Whitmore residence." She listened briefly. "One moment, please." Covering the receiver, she called upstairs. "Miss Eleanor, it's Miss Margaret on the phone." Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs in her comfortable house dress, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. "Thank you, Maria." She took the phone, her face softening at her daughter's voice. "Margaret, dear, how are you today?" Gabriel watched as Eleanor's expression changed subtly. Her smile remained, but something in her eyes dimmed. "Yes, I remember. 6 o'clock." Eleanor nodded. "Charles is insistent, is he? Well, tell him I'll be there." She paused, listening. "No need to send a car. Maria will drive me." After hanging up, Eleanor sighed. "Sunday dinner at Margaret and Charles's tonight." Maria nodded knowingly. "I'll prepare your blue dress. The simpler one, please, not the silk." Eleanor's eyes met Maria's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "And Gabriel is welcome to come along and play in Margaret's garden while we eat." Later that afternoon, Eleanor stood before her mirror, buttoning a faded navy cardigan over her modest dress. Her jewelry box contained diamonds and sapphires that could outshine any star, yet she selected only her thin gold wedding band and a small pearl pin, her concession to formality. "Are you ready, Miss Eleanor?" Maria called from the hallway. Eleanor smoothed the worn fabric of her cardigan, her fingers lingering on a slightly frayed button. $18 million sat in accounts and investments with her name on them, yet here she stood in clothes a bank teller might wear, not from miserliness, but from the wisdom that came with years, knowing that true worth had nothing to do with appearance. "Coming, Maria," she answered, straightening her shoulders with quiet dignity. Margaret and Charles's home stood in stark contrast to Eleanor's aging estate. The 2-story suburban house boasted pristine white columns and manicured hedges, that seemed to stand at attention. Inside, the dining room gleamed with deliberate opulence crystal chandelier catching the evening light, mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, and china that Eleanor recognized as reproductions of antiques far less valuable than the weathered pieces in her own cabinets. "Mother, we're so glad you could join us." Margaret kissed Eleanor's cheek, her perfume too strong and her smile too tight. She wore a designer dress that Eleanor suspected cost more than what most families spent on groceries in a month. Charles appeared from his study, straightening his golf shirt. Eleanor, punctual as always. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. He glanced at her modest attire, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "I see you're comfortable as usual." Eleanor smiled warmly. "How thoughtful of you both to have me over." "Of course, family is everything." Charles gestured toward the dining room with the flourish of a showman. "Shall we?" The table settings were elaborate 3 forks, 2 knives, and water glasses that caught the chandelier's light. Eleanor noticed Margaret fussing with the flower arrangement, adjusting it for the 3rd time. "Margaret tells me you've been busy with church activities." Charles began as he carved the roast with precise movements. "Yes, our quilting circle is making blankets for the children's hospital." Eleanor accepted a plate from Margaret. "Simple work, but meaningful." Charles' smile thinned. "Curious how you find time for charity but haven't managed to repair that sagging porch of yours. The whole neighborhood can see it, you know." Margaret placed a hand on her husband's arm. "Charles, it's an observation, not a criticism." He served himself a generous portion. "I only mention it because appearances matter in this town. The Whitmore name stands for something." Eleanor took a small bite of roast. "The porch has character. Some things improve with age. Some things deteriorate," Charles countered. He set down his knife with a precise click against fine china. "Margaret and I have been discussing this. Your insistence on living so frugally reflects on all of us." "Charles, please." Margaret's voice trembled. "This isn't the time." "When's the time?" "When she's completely drained what little savings she has left." Charles' charm vanished like morning dew. "Eleanor, you live like you're 1 step from the poorhouse. That ancient car, those outdated clothes. People talk." Eleanor set her fork down gently. "I've never much cared what people say." "Well, I do." Charles leaned forward. "You're becoming a financial burden, Eleanor. Margaret worries constantly. What happens when the roof finally gives out? Or when you need more care? We have our retirement to consider." "Mother has managed just fine," Margaret began. "Be quiet, Margaret." Charles' voice dropped dangerously low. "You know I'm right." Eleanor folded her napkin carefully, placing it beside her half-eaten meal. Her heart ached, not for herself, but for her daughter, who sat with downcast eyes, trapped in a marriage to a man who measured worth in dollars and appearances. "If you'll excuse me," Eleanor said softly, rising from her chair. "I'm feeling rather tired. Thank you for dinner." She left the dining room with quiet dignity, the sound of Charles' impatient sigh following her. The hallway stretched before her, silent and cold despite the expensive artwork adorning the walls. Behind her, the wordless tension between Margaret and Charles hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick with unspoken shame. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Eleanor sat alone in her study. The house creaked around her, familiar and comforting despite its age. Moonlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the worn carpet. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the small brass key in the lock of Henry's desk. The drawer slid open with a gentle protest of wood against wood. Inside lay the documents that represented everything her husband had built over a lifetime and everything he'd entrusted to her care. She lifted out the leather portfolio containing the will and trust documents. $18 million. The number still shocked her, even after all these years. Henry had been so clever with his investments, so careful with his planning, yet he never flaunted their wealth, never saw money as anything but a tool for good. "Wealth is responsibility, Ellie," he'd told her the night before he died. His voice had been paper-thin but firm with conviction. Not a prize to be hoarded. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the memory of her husband wash over her. His weathered face, kind eyes crinkled at the corners, the way he'd held her hand on that final night. "Promise me something," he'd whispered. "When the time comes, Make sure it goes to those who understand its true value. Someone who embodies kindness, loyalty, faith. The memory faded, replaced by the harsh echo of Charles's voice at dinner. Financial burden, drain on the family. The cruelty in his eyes as he'd silenced Margaret. Eleanor spread the documents across the desk, the trust agreement with its careful provisions, the will with its precise language. She'd never intended to change Henry's wishes, but perhaps this was exactly what he'd meant. For 30 years, Maria had arrived each morning without fail, through snowstorms and summer heat, through Eleanor's grief after Henry's passing, through her own hardships. Maria, who cleaned not just the house, but brought light into empty rooms. Maria, who remembered how Eleanor took her tea and which flowers she loved in spring. Eleanor reached for her fountain pen, Henry's pen, actually, and pulled a sheet of letterhead from the drawer. To my attorney, she began writing, her handwriting graceful despite her age. I wish to amend my will as follows. The words flowed onto the page, clear and decisive. The house, the investments, the family heirlooms, everything would go to Maria Lopez. Everything except a modest trust for Margaret, protected from Charles's reach. Eleanor paused, pen hovering over the paper. Was this spite, revenge for Charles' cruelty? No, this was justice. Maria had earned what Charles merely coveted. She completed the letter with a steady hand, folded it precisely, and slipped it into an envelope addressed to her attorney. Tomorrow, she would mail it, set these wheels in motion. Eleanor gathered the documents, returning them to the portfolio. As she closed the folder, a single tear escaped, trailing down her weathered cheek. It held everything: the ache of Charles' words, concern for Margaret, and the bittersweet certainty that she was honoring Henry's true wishes. So be it, she whispered to the empty room. The moonlight caught the tear as it fell onto the leather portfolio, a tiny diamond of grief and resolve. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak trees. Henry had planted 50 years before trees that would outlive them all. Morning light spilled through the kitchen windows, painting the worn tile floor in squares of gold. The scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon toast filled the air as Maria moved with practiced efficiency between the stove and counter. Her hands worked steadily, cracking eggs into a bowl while occasionally glancing at Gabriel. The boy sprawled on his stomach across the kitchen floor, lost in his own world. He pushed a small red toy car along invisible roads, making engine noises with his lips pressed together. Vroom, watch out! Gabriel swerved the car dramatically around the leg of a chair. Eleanor paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Something warm bloomed in her chest as she watched them, Maria humming softly as she worked, Gabriel playing with complete abandon. This was what a home should feel like. Good morning, Eleanor said, stepping into the kitchen. Maria looked up, her face brightening. Mrs. Whitmore, I was just about to bring your breakfast tray up. I thought I'd join you down here today. Eleanor eased herself into a chair at the small kitchen table. It's too lovely a morning to eat alone. Gabriel glanced up from his cars. Morning, Mrs. Whitmore. He returned immediately to his game, making screeching brake sounds. Eleanor watched him, smiling. Last night's decision about the will settled in her heart, feeling more right with each passing moment. These were good people, deserving people. Maria set a cup of tea before Eleanor, hesitating as she noticed the older woman's reddened eyes. Is everything all right, Mrs. Whitmore? Maria asked quietly, concern etching her features. You seem troubled this morning. Eleanor wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. Just a poor night's sleep, Maria. Nothing to worry about. Maria didn't look convinced. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from Eleanor, her eyes questioning. Are you certain? After yesterday's dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Charles. She left the question hanging. Eleanor reached across the table and patted Maria's hand. 30 years you've worked in this house, Maria. 30 years of loyalty and care. I've never properly thanked you for that. Maria blushed, shaking her head. It's my job, Mrs. Whitmore. No, it's far more than a job. Eleanor sipped her tea, choosing her words carefully. You've brought life into these old rooms. Kindness, joy. She nodded toward Gabriel. And him. What a blessing that boy Island. Gabriel looked up at the mention of himself, abandoning his cars to stand and approach the table. I'm drawing you a picture later, he announced to Eleanor. Of the big tree outside, the one with the swing. I shall treasure it, Eleanor promised. Maria wiped her hands on her apron, clearly moved by Eleanor's words, but still sensing something left unsaid. Mrs. Whitmore, please, Eleanor interrupted gently. Let's just enjoy this beautiful morning together. Understanding passed between the women. Maria nodded and rose to finish preparing breakfast. Gabriel sidled up to Eleanor's chair, leaning against it. Can I sit with you? Without waiting for an answer, he climbed into her lap. His small body was warm against hers as he wrapped his arms around her neck in a fierce hug. Eleanor closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of his hair, soap, and sunshine. She held him close, feeling a peace she hadn't known in years. Family comes in many forms, she whispered to herself, so softly that only her heart could hear. Wednesday afternoon sunshine bathed the estate in golden light as Margaret's car crunched up the gravel driveway. She parked haphazardly, almost hitting one of Eleanor's prized rose bushes, and hurried toward the front door with her shoulders hunched. Eleanor opened the door before Margaret could knock, her weathered hand resting on the doorframe. I was hoping you'd visit today, Eleanor said, stepping aside to let her daughter enter. Margaret rushed in, her face flushed, and eyes darting nervously. Mom, I'm so sorry about Sunday. The things Charles said. She stopped, pressing her lips together as tears threatened. Eleanor guided her into the sitting room, where afternoon light streamed through lace curtains onto the faded furniture. The room had seen better days, but it remained dignified, much like Eleanor herself. Sit down, dear. Maria just made fresh lemonade. Margaret perched on the edge of the sofa, twisting her wedding ring. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. I should have spoken up. I should have defended you. Margaret's voice cracked. He had no right to talk to you like that. Eleanor poured lemonade into 2 glasses, her movements unhurried. Your husband has strong opinions about how others should live. He's under so much pressure at work. Margaret accepted the glass with trembling fingers. The company's cutting positions. He worries constantly about money. Is that so? Eleanor kept her voice neutral. He thinks about the future, our retirement, healthcare costs. Margaret stared into her lemonade. He says, we need to be practical about financial burdens. Eleanor caught the implication. Charles saw her as nothing but a liability. Margaret, look at me. Eleanor waited until her daughter met her eyes. I have never asked you or Charles for money. I never will. I know, Mom. Margaret rubbed at a water spot on her glass. But Charles says we need to plan ahead. He thinks your house is falling apart, that you'll need assisted living soon. He's just concerned. Concerned about my money running out, Eleanor clarified. Margaret flinched. That's not what I meant. It's what he meant. A heavy silence fell between them. Through the window, they could see Maria hanging laundry while Gabriel chased butterflies through the garden. He's not a bad man, Margaret whispered, sounding as if she needed to convince herself. He just wants security. Eleanor nodded, deciding in that moment to keep her 18 million fortune a secret. Charles's greed would only grow if he knew the truth, and Margaret wasn't ready to see it yet. We all want security, dear. Eleanor patted her daughter's hand. But there are different kinds. The kind that comes from bank accounts and the kind that comes from love. Margaret finished her lemonade and stood, smoothing her wrinkled blouse. I should get back. Charles will be home early today. Eleanor walked her to the door, watching as Margaret fumbled with her car keys. Mom? Margaret paused. Are we okay? We're more than okay, Eleanor assured her. We're family. Margaret managed a small smile before hurrying to her car. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching as her daughter backed out and drove away, gravel spraying beneath her tires. One day, Margaret, Eleanor whispered to the settling dust, you'll see his true colors. Saturday morning brought perfect gardening weather. The early summer sun warmed without scorching, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet fragrance of Eleanor's roses across the garden. Miss Eleanor, these pruning shears need sharpening, Maria said, examining the blades. The cuts aren't clean. Eleanor straightened slowly from where she'd been removing spent blooms. There's a whetstone in the garden shed. Henry always kept his tools sharp. Gabriel darted between them, a wooden airplane clutched in his hand. Look, Grandma, it's flying! He zoomed past, making engine noises with his mouth. Eleanor smiled at the grandma name he'd given her. It felt right somehow. Careful near the thorns, Mijo, Maria called, watching him with protective eyes. Eleanor adjusted her white-brimmed hat. Your boy brings such life to this old place. He has enough energy for 10 children, Maria laughed, wiping her brow with her forearm. The peaceful morning shattered at the sound of tires on gravel. A sleek black luxury car pulled up the driveway, its engine purring before cutting off abruptly. Maria tensed. That's Mr. Whitmore's car. Charles emerged in pressed khakis and a polo shirt, designer sunglasses perched on his nose. He surveyed the property with the critical eye of an appraiser before spotting them among the roses. Well, isn't this quaint? He called, strolling toward them with manufactured casualness. The lady of the manor playing in the dirt. Eleanor straightened, garden gloves still on her hands. Charles, we weren't expecting you. Clearly. His gaze flickered dismissively to Maria, who lowered her eyes and stepped back. I should check on lunch, Maria murmured, trying to locate Gabriel. No need to scurry off on my account, Charles said, though his tone suggested the opposite. I actually came to make amends. Margaret's been upset about our disagreement last Sunday. Eleanor removed her gloves. That's thoughtful of you. Yes, well. Charles glanced around the garden, lips curling slightly, though I see why I was concerned. This place is practically falling apart. These rose bushes need professional attention, the paint is peeling, and that garden shed looks ready to collapse. Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The estate has good bones, Charles. It just needs care. What it needs is money, he countered, running a hand along a weathered trellis. Which is exactly my point from Sunday. Pride is expensive, Eleanor. So is arrogance, she replied quietly. Charles's smile hardened. I'm trying to help you see reality. This property is beyond your means to maintain. Margaret and I could buy it from me, Eleanor finished. Turn it into what? Condominiums? Charles laughed. Now who's being dramatic? I'm talking about family looking after family. While they spoke, Gabriel had crept closer, airplane forgotten in his hand. He studied Charles with undisguised curiosity, head tilted. You look like the man in Mommy's picture, Gabriel said suddenly. Charles glanced down, noticing the boy for the first time. What picture? The one she keeps in her special box. Gabriel stepped closer. She takes it out sometimes when she's sad. A flash of discomfort crossed Charles's face. Your mother should teach you not to interrupt adults. Gabriel wasn't deterred. He moved even closer, studying Charles's face with innocent intensity. Then, as if sharing an important secret, he leaned toward Charles and whispered words that froze the summer air. Mommy says, you're my daddy. The garden froze in horrified silence. Charles stumbled backward as if the child had struck him, nearly toppling into a rosebush. What nonsense, his face drained of color. The boy is clearly confused. Eleanor's hand gripped her cane, knuckles white with shock. The earth seemed to tilt beneath her feet as her mind raced to connect impossibilities. Gabriel! Maria sprinted across the garden, dust rising from her hurried footsteps. She clutched her son's shoulders, pulling him against her skirt. Mijo, go inside now. But Mama, now, Gabriel. Her voice cracked with panic. Gabriel's eyes widened at his mother's tone. He glanced between the adults, suddenly aware he'd said something terrible. He backed away slowly before turning to run toward the house. Charles straightened his collar, composure returning like a mask sliding back into place. Children and their imagination. I should be going. Don't you dare move. Eleanor's voice came quiet but steel-edged. She stepped forward, cane planted firmly. Is what that child said true? Charles laughed, the sound brittle. Eleanor, surely you don't believe. Answer me. Her eyes, usually gentle, had hardened. It's Gabriel, your son. This is absurd. I don't need to dignify such. Charles. Eleanor's voice dropped dangerously low. I've known you 20 years. I see his eyes in yours. I see your chin, your gestures, the truth. Now. Maria sank to her knees in the garden soil, tears streaming down her face. Please, Miss Eleanor, I never meant. Charles cut her off with a sharp gesture. Keep quiet if you know what's good for you. Don't speak to her that way in my home. Eleanor's voice shook with rage. Charles's charm vanished entirely. Fine. You want the truth? Yes. We had a brief indiscretion. Years ago. Before I married Margaret. It meant nothing. Maria flinched as if slapped. And you knew? Eleanor turned to Maria, her heart breaking at the woman's shame-filled expression. I worked in his office, cleaning after hours. Maria couldn't meet Eleanor's eyes. It was before he married Miss Margaret. When I found out I was pregnant, he paid me to disappear. Charles headed toward his car. Ancient history, not worth discussing. You abandon your own child and call it not worth discussing? Eleanor's voice followed him. Does Margaret know? No one knows, and no one needs to. Charles yanked open his car door. The boy means nothing to me. He never did. Maria's sob cut through the garden at his cruel words. I'll deny everything, Charles warned, sliding into the driver's seat. It's my word against the maid's. The engine roared to life. Fix this, Eleanor, or we'll all regret it. Gravel sprayed as he reversed down the driveway, leaving behind a cloud of dust and shattered peace. Eleanor stood motionless, watching until the car disappeared. Then she turned to Maria, still kneeling in the dirt, shoulders heaving with silent grief. I'm so sorry, Maria whispered brokenly. I'll pack our things. We'll leave today. Eleanor lowered herself carefully beside Maria, her old knees protesting against the hard ground. She reached out, taking Maria's trembling hand between both of hers. No, she said gently. You're not going anywhere. But what I did was long before Margaret. And that beautiful boy deserves better than a father who denies him. Maria looked up, face streaked with tears and garden soil. Miss Eleanor, this will tear your family apart. Eleanor squeezed Maria's hand. It changes everything, but maybe this was meant to come to light. Darkness settled over the estate as Eleanor closed her bedroom door. The day's revelations weighed on her like stones. She moved to her window, gazing at the moon that hung pale and perfect above the oak trees her husband had planted decades ago. Eleanor unclasped her simple gold necklace and placed it on her dresser. Her reflection showed a face lined with years but eyes still sharp with purpose. How strange that in a single moment, everything she thought she knew about her family had shattered. What would you have done, Thomas? She whispered to her late husband's photograph beside her bed. His kind eyes seemed to watch her, offering no answers but perhaps comfort in their steadiness. Eleanor lowered herself onto the edge of her bed. The distant sound of Gabriel's laughter floated up from downstairs where Maria must be tucking him in for the night. Such an innocent child, caught in a web of adult failings. Margaret deserves to know the truth, she said aloud to the empty room. Yet the thought of telling her daughter made Eleanor's heart ache. Margaret had built her life around Charles, believing his integrity despite his flaws. This revelation would devastate her. Was it kinder to keep the secret? But secrets poison everything they touch, Eleanor murmured. She reached for her Bible on the nightstand, its leather worn soft from years of handling. The pages fell open to Proverbs, the truth shall set you free. Eleanor ran her finger along the familiar words. Truth had already erupted into their lives through a child's innocent words. There would be no containing it now. Charles would deny everything, make Maria seem like a liar. Margaret would be caught between husband and mother, forced to choose who to believe. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling suddenly every one of her 78 years. The decision about her will seemed clearer than ever. Maria had raised Gabriel alone, with dignity and faith, asking nothing from anyone. Meanwhile, Charles had denied his own flesh and blood, treating both mother and child as inconveniences to be discarded. My fortune was meant for those who embody kindness and loyalty. She reminded herself of Thomas's words. The thought of Charles ever controlling her husband's hard-earned millions made her stomach turn. No, her decision was right. Maria and Gabriel would inherit everything, not out of spite, but justice. Eleanor rose slowly from the bed, her knees protesting as she lowered herself to the floor beside it. The carpet was soft beneath her as she clasped her hands together. Lord, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to make this right. Margaret will be heartbroken. Maria carries such shame for something that wasn't her sin alone. and that precious boy deserves to grow up knowing he matters. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she continued praying in the darkness. I can change my will, but I cannot change hearts. Charles' pride blinds him. Margaret's love keeps her captive. Show me how to speak truth with mercy. Give me wisdom beyond my years. A gentle peace settled over her as she poured out her worries. The house creaked softly around her, a familiar companion to her nighttime prayers. Whatever happens, Eleanor whispered, let love be our guide through this storm. She remained kneeling despite her aching joints, hands still clasped in prayer. Lord, show me how to heal this family. First, Baptist stained glass windows cast colored light across the sanctuary as Eleanor slipped into her usual pew, Maria and Gabriel beside her. Eleanor wore her Sunday best, a simple navy dress with a pearl brooch, while Maria had dressed Gabriel in pressed khakis and a little blue tie that made him look older than his 8 years. Remember to use your indoor voice, Maria whispered to Gabriel, who nodded solemnly before pulling a small toy car from his pocket. Eleanor patted the boy's hand. After service, we'll have those cinnamon rolls you like. The church filled quickly, familiar faces nodding respectfully toward Eleanor as they passed. She'd worshipped here for 50 years, longer than most members could remember. Her gaze drifted to the door just as Margaret entered alone, her face tight with worry. Eleanor raised her hand in a small wave. Margaret hesitated, then made her way over. Charles is parking the car, she explained, sliding in beside her mother. Her eyes darted nervously to Maria and Gabriel. Gabriel beamed. Hi, Miss Margaret, look at my car. Margaret's smile flickered. That's very nice, Gabriel. The organ began, drowning further conversation as the congregation rose for the opening hymn. Eleanor noticed Charles slipping late, taking a seat near the back, deliberately separate from them. Throughout the sermon on forgiveness, Eleanor felt the weight of stairs. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the town's only beauty salon, kept turning to whisper to her friend. The Miller family, 3 pews ahead, glanced back repeatedly. Eleanor held her hymnal higher, focusing on Pastor Brown's words about healing broken relationships. Gabriel squirmed beside her, innocent to the undercurrents swirling around him. How quickly word had spread about his connection to Charles, Eleanor thought. Small towns kept few secrets. After the final prayer, people filed slowly toward the exit. Eleanor took Gabriel's hand while Maria gathered their things. The boys skipped ahead as they reached the church steps, stopping to examine a butterfly on the railing. Eleanor heard Charles's voice before she saw him, sharp and hostile near the church parking lot. You had no right, he hissed at Maria, who had stepped away to collect Gabriel. Keep that boy away from my wife. Maria straightened her shoulders. Gabriel is your son too, Charles. I deserve my reputation, Charles cut in, unaware of the churchgoers slowing to listen. You're trying to ruin everything I've built. Eleanor moved toward them, but Pastor Brown reached Maria first. Everything all right here? He asked, placing himself between Charles and Maria. Charles smoothed his tie. Just a misunderstanding, Pastor. Whispers rippled through the departing congregation. Mrs. Patterson covered her mouth in exaggerated shock while pointing toward Gabriel. The Millers hurried their children to their car as if scandal might be contagious. Margaret stood frozen on the church steps, watching her husband, her face a mask of painful denial. Eleanor reached Maria's side, taking her hand firmly. We're heading home now, Pastor. Thank you for the lovely service. Maria's eyes glistened with unshed tears as Charles stormed away toward his car, where Margaret now waited, her back rigid. Hold your head high, Eleanor whispered to Maria. You've done nothing to be ashamed of. Gabriel ran back to them, oblivious to the drama. Can we get the rolls now, Grandma? Eleanor smiled at him, squeezing Maria's hand tighter. Yes, sweetheart. And then we'll go home. They walked down the tree-lined street together, Eleanor and Maria side by side, Gabriel running ahead to collect acorns. Behind them, the murmur of gossip continued on the church steps, but Eleanor kept her gaze forward, her grip on Maria's hand unwavering. They'll talk for a while, Eleanor said quietly, but we'll walk through this together. Eleanor arranged the tea service with care, placing her mother's china cups on saucers edged with faded gold. Outside, afternoon sunlight warmed the estate's garden where Maria had planted fresh marigolds that morning. Is Margaret really coming? Maria asked, setting a plate of sugar cookies on the table. Eleanor nodded. She called an hour ago. I think she needs answers, even if she's afraid to hear them. Gabriel burst into the sitting room, a toy airplane swooping through the air. Can I have 2 cookies? After you wash your hands, Maria reminded him gently. The crunch of tires on gravel announced Margaret's arrival. Eleanor smoothed her simple cotton dress and took a steadying breath. Through the window, she watched her daughter sit in the car for several moments before finally emerging, her shoulders tense as she walked toward the house. Mother, Margaret said stiffly when Eleanor opened the door. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her makeup carefully applied to hide sleepless nights. I'm so glad you came. Eleanor embraced her, feeling Margaret's initial resistance melt slightly as they touched. Come, sit with us. In the sitting room, Margaret perched at the edge of an armchair, declining cookies but accepting tea. Her gaze avoided Maria, who busied herself pouring. How are you holding up? Eleanor asked gently. Margaret's fingers tightened around her teacup. Everyone at church is talking. Charles says it will blow over. An awkward silence fell. Gabriel, sensing the tension, slipped closer to Eleanor, leaning against her chair. I made a picture at school, he offered, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. It's our family. Margaret accepted it reluctantly. Stick figures stood in front of a house clearly labeled Maria, me, Grandma, and one tall figure with a tie. That's Daddy Charles, Gabriel said innocently, pointing to the tallest figure. Teacher said to draw all our family. The teacup in Margaret's hand trembled, tea sloshing over the rim. Is this some kind of cruel joke? Margaret Eleanor began. No. Margaret stood abruptly. I need the truth, all of it, now. Maria pulled Gabriel close. Maybe Gabriel should play outside while we talk. I want to know if what this child says is true, Margaret demanded, her voice rising. Is he Charles's son? Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand. Margaret, please sit down. Just answer me. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Eleanor met her daughter's desperate gaze. Yes, she said softly. Gabriel is Charles's son. Margaret's face crumpled. How long have you known? Just since that day in the garden, Eleanor explained. Maria worked for Charles's company before you were married. She left when she discovered she was pregnant. And you didn't tell me immediately? Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. You let me find out like this, in front of everyone at church? I was trying to protect you, Eleanor said, to find the right moment. Protect me? Margaret laughed bitterly. By hiding the truth? By changing your will to favor them over me? Maria gasped. Margaret, that's not. Stop. Margaret backed toward the door. My husband has a child with our maid, and my mother chooses them over me. I don't know which betrayal hurts more. Eleanor rose. Margaret, please, we're family. Family doesn't do this. Margaret grabbed her purse. I need to go. Eleanor followed her outside, watching helplessly as Margaret fumbled with her car keys. Don't drive like this, Eleanor pleaded. Stay. Talk to us. Margaret slammed the car door, tires spinning on gravel as she accelerated down the driveway. Eleanor stood motionless, watching the car swerve onto the main road, her heart breaking as her daughter fled from truth she wasn't ready to accept. Margaret sat in the darkened living room, a cold cup of tea forgotten beside her. The grandfather clock chimed 9 as headlights swept across the walls. Charles returning from his evening meeting. Her stomach knotted as the front door opened. Charles stepped inside. His tie loosened. He froze when he spotted her in the shadows. What are you doing sitting in the dark? He flipped on a lamp, revealing her tear-stained face. You look terrible. I saw Eleanor today. Margaret's voice was hollow. And Gabriel. Charles's expression hardened. He set his briefcase down with deliberate calm and poured himself a drink. So that's what this is about. He took a long sip. Your mother filling your head with nonsense. The boy called you Daddy Charles. Charles laughed, the sound brittle. And you believe a child? They have vivid imaginations. Is he yours? Margaret stared directly at him, searching his face for truth. Just tell me that much. Charles loosened his tie further. This is exactly what Maria wants to create chaos. She's manipulating your mother, turning her against us to get her hands on money. Money? Margaret blinked. What money? Mother barely has enough to maintain the estate. Charles waved dismissively. Your mother is sitting on a fortune. That house, the land, is worth millions, and Maria knows it. This isn't about money. Margaret stood, her voice finding strength. This is about whether my husband fathered a child with another woman. Charles slammed his glass down. This is absolutely about money. Your mother has always disliked me. Now she's found the perfect weapon, a woman and child that she can use to cut us out of our inheritance. Our inheritance? Margaret's voice rose. Is that all you've ever seen my mother as? A walking checkbook? Don't be naive, Margaret. Charles moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness. Maria worked as a cleaner at my office years ago. She's nothing. A manipulative gold digger who saw an opportunity. You're not denying it, Margaret whispered, realization dawning. Gabriel is your son. Charles' face twisted. Your mother has always interfered in our marriage. She's never thought I was good enough for you. Now she's trying to destroy us. Answer me. Margaret's hands trembled. Is Gabriel your son? What matters is that your mother is turning you against me. Charles gripped her shoulders. Are you going to let her come between us after everything I've done for you? Margaret pulled away, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The handsome face that had once charmed her now seemed cold. Calculating, I can't do this. She turned toward the stairs. I need to sleep. Margaret. His voice stopped her. Remember who pays for this house, your clothes, your lifestyle. Remember who you are without me. The threat hung in the air. Margaret felt the invisible chains tightening around her, the financial dependence, the social standing, the fear of starting over. We'll discuss this when you are thinking clearly, Charles said, his voice softening to the tone he used when closing business deals. Later, curled on her side of their king-size bed, Margaret wept silently into her pillow. The weight of betrayal crushed her chest, making each breath painful. Beside her, Charles lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, jaw clenched tight with wounded pride. The space between them, mere inches of expensive Egyptian cotton, felt vast as an ocean. Margaret had never felt more alone than lying next to the stranger she had married. The afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across Eleanor's sitting room. Maria sat hunched on the edge of the sofa, her shoulders trembling, hands twisting the handkerchief Eleanor had given her. I should have told you long ago, Maria's voice broke. About Charles, about Gabriel, all of it. Eleanor reached across the space between them and covered Maria's hands with her own. The older woman's touch was gentle, her fingers weathered by time but steady with purpose. Look at me, Maria. When Maria lifted her gaze, Eleanor's eyes held no judgment, only warmth. We all carry secrets, Eleanor said. Some to protect ourselves, some to protect others. I understand why you kept yours. But now everything is ruined. Maria gestured helplessly. Margaret hates me. The tongue is talking. And Charles, her voice caught. He will make Gabriel suffer for this. Eleanor straightened, a sudden fierceness entering her expression. Charles has no power here. Not in this house. I worked for his company before I came to you, Maria admitted. It was brief. I was young and foolish. When I discovered I was pregnant, he denied everything and fired me. She looked down. You gave me a job when no one else would. You never asked questions, and I never regretted it. Eleanor squeezed her hand. Your dignity in silence all these years, your devotion to your son and to this household, these things matter more than old mistakes. A small crash from the hallway interrupted them. Gabriel peeked around the doorframe, his dark eyes wide. Sorry, Grandma Eleanor. I knocked over the plant. Eleanor's heart skipped at the word grandma. It had slipped from the boy's lips so naturally, as if it had always belonged there. Come here, my boy, Eleanor called, her voice soft. What have you got there? Gabriel padded across the carpet, clutching a large piece of construction paper. His smile brightened the room as he proudly displayed his artwork. It's our family, he announced, holding up his drawing. Maria wiped her eyes quickly, not wanting her son to see her tears. The crayon figures stood hand in hand beneath a bright yellow sundae. A small house dominated the background, much grander than the actual estate, with flowers dotting a green lawn. 4 stick figures stood in a row, the tallest labeled Grandma Eleanor in wobbly letters, then Mommy, then me, and finally Aunt Margaret, slightly apart but still connected. That's beautiful, Eleanor whispered, studying each figure. No, Charles. In Gabriel's innocent world, their family was complete just as it was. Do you really like it? Gabriel asked, climbing onto the sofa between them. I love it, Eleanor assured him. May I keep it? Gabriel nodded enthusiastically. I made it specially for you. Later that evening, after Maria had tucked Gabriel into bed in the room that was quickly becoming his own, Eleanor stood alone in her bedroom. She held the drawing carefully, her fingers tracing the crayon figures. With reverent movements, she pinned it to the wall beside her bed, where it would be the first thing she saw each morning. The childish artwork looked strangely perfect against the faded floral wallpaper. Family, she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek even as she smiled. This unexpected boy had given her something she thought lost forever, the joy of being needed, of being grandma. Eleanor touched each figure on the page gently, like a blessing, before turning out the light. A week later, Eleanor stood in the kitchen, arranging a centerpiece of freshly cut hydrangeas from the garden. The dining room table gleamed with polished silver that hadn't been used in months. Maria moved efficiently around her, putting the finishing touches on the roast chicken that filled the house with mouth-watering aromas. Do you think she'll come? Maria asked, her voice soft with worry. Eleanor adjusted a blue bloom. Margaret said she would. I believe her. Gabriel burst into the kitchen, his shirt newly pressed. Is Aunt Margaret here yet? Not yet, sweetheart, Eleanor smiled. Would you like to help me finish setting the table? The doorbell chimed, and Gabriel raced to answer it. Eleanor followed more slowly, smoothing her dress. She'd chosen a simple but elegant outfit tonight, not her usual worn cardigan, but nothing too ostentatious either. Margaret stood on the doorstep, looking thin and tired. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but she managed a smile when Gabriel greeted her with enthusiasm. You came. He grabbed her hand, pulling her inside. I promised Grandma I would. Margaret's gaze met Eleanor's over Gabriel's head. Something vulnerable flickered in her expression. Eleanor stepped forward, embracing her daughter. I'm so glad you're here. Dinner began with cautious conversation. The tension gradually dissolved as Gabriel chatted happily about his drawings and his new school. Even Margaret relaxed enough to laugh when he described his teacher's dramatic reading voice. More potatoes? Maria offered. Margaret accepted with a small smile. Everything is delicious. Thank you. Eleanor watched them interact, hope warming her chest. This was what she wanted her family healing, finding their way toward forgiveness. The front door slammed open without warning. Heavy footsteps stormed the hallway. Charles appeared in the dining room doorway, his face flushed with anger. So this is where you disappeared to. Margaret flinched. Charles, I told you I was having dinner with Mother. With Mother and her little conspiracy? He sneered, looking from Maria to Gabriel, who shrank back in his chair. How cozy. Eleanor stood, her napkin falling to the floor. You weren't invited, Charles. I don't need an invitation to retrieve my wife. He stepped closer, looming over the table. What lies have you been feeding her? That Maria here deserves my money? That this boy, he flicked a contemptuous glance at Gabriel, has any claim on my name? Maria stood protectively beside her son. Gabriel, go to your room now. Charles laughed coldly. Yes, hide him away. That's been your strategy all along, hasn't it? Waiting in the shadows, playing the loyal servant while plotting to steal everything? That's enough. Eleanor's voice cracked through the room like thunder. Everyone froze. Even Charles seemed startled by the authority in her tone. Maria has shown more loyalty, more dignity, more true family devotion in her time with me than you have demonstrated in 20 years of marriage to my daughter. Eleanor straightened to her full height, which is why I have left my entire estate, every penny of the $18 million to her and Gabriel. Charles' face drained of color. 18 million? My husband's legacy, which you would have known about if you'd ever cared for anything beyond appearances. Charles stared at her, then at Maria, his expression twisting from shock to rage. He grabbed Margaret's arm. We're leaving. Now. Margaret hesitated, looking at her mother. This isn't over, Charles snarled, releasing Margaret to jab a finger toward Eleanor. You're a senile old woman who's being manipulated. No court will uphold this. He stormed out, the front door slamming so hard the windows rattled. His voice carried back through the still open door. We'll see about that in court. 3 days after the disastrous dinner, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table. The morning newspaper spread before her. Her hands trembled as she read the headline. Wealthy widow's fortune. Servant schemes for millions. The article quoted sources close to the family, clearly Charles, claiming Maria had manipulated an elderly woman into disinheriting her own daughter. The story painted Maria as a calculating gold digger who had used her child to win Eleanor's sympathy. Please don't read that garbage, Maria said, entering with a teapot. Her eyes were red-rimmed from another sleepless night. Eleanor folded the paper. I need to know what we're facing. The telephone rang. Maria answered it, her expression hardening as she listened. No comment, she said firmly, hanging up. Another reporter? Eleanor asked. Maria nodded. The third this morning. The mailman arrived an hour later with a bundle of envelopes. Among the bills and ordinary correspondence were 5 handwritten letters, all addressed to Eleanor, all expressing disgust at her decision. How could you choose a servant over your own flesh and blood? One read. That Mexican woman has obviously tricked you, said another. Eleanor set them aside, her heart heavy. Small towns have long memories but short tempers, she murmured. That afternoon, Gabriel came home from school in tears. The other children had called his mother terrible names. Eleanor hugged him, close fury and helplessness warring within her. It will pass, sweetheart, she promised, though she wasn't certain it would. Margaret called that evening, her voice tight with strain. I can't even buy groceries without someone whispering behind my back, she said. Charles is making this into a circus. I'm so sorry, dear. Are you? Margaret's voice cracked. Because this whole town is being torn apart, and for what? So you can make a point? Eleanor closed her eyes. That's not fair. None of this is fair. Not to me, not to Maria, not to anyone. The line went dead. Later that night, Eleanor found Maria packing a small suitcase in her quarters. What are you doing? Eleanor asked, though she already knew. We should go, Miss Eleanor, Gabriel, and me. Maria folded a simple dress with care. Charles won't stop. The things people are saying. My boy doesn't deserve this. Eleanor took the dress from Maria's hands, placing it back in the drawer. If you leave, Charles wins. Is that what you want? I want peace, Maria whispered. For all of us. We'll find it together. Eleanor took Maria's hands. Please, you and Gabriel are my family now. Don't let Charles take that from me too. Maria's resistance crumbled. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. The next morning brought more headlines, more phone calls, more hostile letters. Eleanor felt the strain in her chest, a tightness that wouldn't ease. At breakfast, she barely touched her food. By afternoon, her breathing had grown shallow. You should rest, Maria urged, helping her to the parlor. Eleanor sank onto the sofa, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The room seemed to tilt strangely. Outside, she could hear Gabriel playing, his laughter a bright counterpoint to the darkness closing in around her. Maria, she whispered, I think something's wrong. She tried to stand, but a crushing pain seized her chest. Eleanor gasped, clutching at her heart as the room spun violently. The last thing she saw was Maria's terrified face as she collapsed to the floor. Dr. Wilson closed his medical bag with a soft click. Eleanor lay propped against pillows, her face pale but calm despite the ordeal. Bed rest for at least a week, he instructed. The EKG shows no permanent damage, but that was a serious episode. Your heart's telling you to slow down, Eleanor. Eleanor nodded, too tired to argue. Thank you, doctor. After he left, Maria lingered by the bedroom door. I've called Margaret 3 times. She's on her way. Good, Eleanor murmured, her eyes drifting closed. And Charles? She didn't mention him. 20 minutes later, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled, eyes wild with fear. Mother! She rushed to the bedside, taking Eleanor's hand. What happened? Why didn't anyone call me sooner? Eleanor squeezed her daughter's fingers. It's nothing serious, dear. Just my old heart complaining. Nothing serious? Margaret's voice cracked. Maria said you collapsed. Maria quietly excused herself, leaving mother and daughter alone. Margaret sank into the chair beside the bed, still clutching Eleanor's hand. I thought, Margaret swallowed hard. When Maria called, I thought you were. Not yet, Eleanor smiled faintly. I've got a bit more fight left in me. Margaret stared at her mother's face, the new lines of fatigue, the shadows beneath her eyes. This strong woman suddenly looked so fragile, so mortal. The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. This is killing you, she whispered. All of it. The stress, the gossip, the lawsuits. Eleanor turned her gaze to the window, where late afternoon light filtered through lace curtains. What's killing me is watching what Charles is doing to this family. He says he's protecting our interests. Is that what he told you? Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. Look at me, Margaret. Is this what protection looks like? Margaret's eyes welled with tears. He wasn't always like this. Perhaps not. But this is who he is now. Eleanor shifted, wincing slightly. The money has revealed his true heart. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of truth settling between them. I've known about Charles and Maria for years, Eleanor finally said. Margaret looked up, startled. What? Gabriel has your grandfather's eyes. I noticed it the first time I saw him. Eleanor's smile was sad. I didn't say anything because I thought foolishly that some secrets were better kept. Why tell me now? Because you deserve the truth. Eleanor reached out, touching her daughter's tear-stained cheek. And because I see you disappearing, Margaret, becoming smaller each day, like a flower without sunlight. Margaret bowed her head, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. There's a life beyond Charles, Eleanor continued softly. A life where you don't apologize for taking up space, where you don't measure your words against his anger. I don't know how to leave, Margaret whispered. Our whole life is tangled together. Vines can be cut, dear one. Roots can be replanted. Margaret looked at her mother through tears. You make it sound so simple. Not simple, necessary. Eleanor's eyes were clear and certain. Choose love for yourself first. The rest will follow. Margaret lifted her mother's weathered hand to her lips, pressing a gentle kiss against the papery skin. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she whispered. The county courthouse buzzed with whispers. Every wooden bench was filled with townsfolk pretending they'd come for justice when they'd really come for gossip. Charles sat at the plaintiff's table, back straight, chin lifted. His expensive suit and gleaming cufflinks declared victory before the first word was spoken. When the side door opened, a hush fell over the room. Eleanor entered slowly, leaning on her cane. Maria walked beside her, one hand ready to catch Eleanor should she falter. Gabriel followed, wide-eyed at the crowd, and Margaret trailed behind, her face a careful mask. Judge Henderson entered, his weathered face revealing nothing, as he surveyed the packed courtroom. All rise, called the bailiff. After the formalities concluded, Charles's lawyer stood a tall man with slick hair and practiced sympathy in his voice. Your Honor, this case is quite simple. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore is an elderly woman who has fallen under undue influence. Her longtime employee has manipulated her fragile state, resulting in a will that disinherits her only daughter in favor of a mere housekeeper. Charles nodded along, his face arranged in an expression of pained concern. The evidence will show that Mrs. Lopez cleverly positioned herself to steal what rightfully belongs to Mrs. Whitmore's family. When Charles took the stand, he spoke with practiced charm. My mother-in-law has always been eccentric, Your Honor. But recently, her grip on reality has slipped. I've watched Maria isolate her, feed her stories, even use her own child to emotionally manipulate a vulnerable old woman. His voice cracked with manufactured emotion. We only want to protect Eleanor from herself. Maria testified next, her voice soft but steady. I've served Mrs. Whitmore for 30 years. I never asked for anything beyond my wages. I never expected anything more. If she chose to change her will, that was her decision alone. And the boy, Charles' lawyer demanded, you used him to secure your position, didn't you? Maria's eyes flashed. Gabriel is a child. He speaks the truth as children do. I never asked him to say anything to anyone. When Eleanor's turn came, Charles smirked. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something that made the man nod confidently. Eleanor walked slowly to the witness stand. The court clerk helped her settle into the chair. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Henderson said kindly, please tell the court why you changed your will. Eleanor looked out at the crowded room, at the faces of neighbors she'd known for decades. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly. I changed my will because I wanted my estate to go to someone who understands its true value. She folded her hands in her lap. My husband built his fortune not just with business sense, but with integrity, with kindness, with faith. Her eyes found Charles, and she held his gaze without flinching. Money reveals character, Your Honor. It doesn't create it. I've watched Charles pursue wealth as if it were air to breathe. I've seen what that pursuit has done to my daughter, to this family. Eleanor turned toward Maria and Gabriel. Maria has shown me 30 years of loyalty, dignity, and grace. Gabriel has brought joy back into a house that had forgotten laughter. They embody the values my husband and I cherished. Judge Henderson considered her words, his expression thoughtful. After a brief recess, the courtroom fell silent as he returned to deliver his verdict. Having examined all testimony and evidence, I find no signs of manipulation or undue influence. Mrs. Whitmore is of sound mind and entitled to dispose of her property as she sees fit. The will stands as written. Charles shot to his feet, face flushing deep red. Without a word, he stormed down the aisle and shoved through the double doors. Eleanor reached for Maria's hand, squeezing it gently. It was over. Evening light streamed through the old stained glass windows of Eleanor's dining room, painting the oak table in patches of amber and blue. For the first time in years, the grand estate felt truly alive again. The tension that had held everyone captive for weeks had finally broken, leaving behind a peaceful quiet that settled over the house like a blessing. Margaret stood awkwardly in the entryway, watching Maria arrange a simple bouquet of garden flowers. Her hands fidgeted with her purse strap, years of guilt and misunderstanding weighing on her shoulders. "Maria," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Maria turned, her expression cautious. Margaret stepped forward, tears filling her eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything, for the way Charles treated you, for how I stood by and said nothing all these years." Her voice broke. "For not seeing what my mother saw in you." Without hesitation, Maria opened her arms. Margaret fell into them, sobbing against the shoulder of the woman who had been invisible to her for so long. "You have nothing to apologize for," Maria whispered, patting Margaret's back gently. "We were all caught in a storm not of our making." Eleanor watched from the doorway, leaning on her cane, her heart overflowing. Gabriel darted past her, racing to wrap himself around both women. "Are we all friends now?" he asked, looking up with those innocent eyes that seemed to cut straight to the truth of things. Margaret pulled back, wiping her tears, and knelt to Gabriel's level. "Yes, we're all family now." Gabriel beamed and dashed to Eleanor, throwing his small arms around her waist. "Did you hear that, Grandma? We're all family." "Grandma," Eleanor repeated, stroking his hair. The word fell from his lips so naturally, as if he'd been calling her that his whole life. "Yes, my dear boy, we are." They gathered around the dining table, not in the formal dining room where Eleanor had hosted countless dinners over the decades, but in the cozy breakfast nook overlooking the garden. Maria had prepared a simple meal: roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, and warm bread. "This reminds me of the meals my mother used to make," Eleanor said, passing the bread basket to Margaret. "Before all the fancy dinners and social obligations, just good food and people you love." Maria smiled. "My mother always said a meal shared is twice blessed." She was a wise woman. Eleanor nodded, just like her daughter. They ate without hurry, savoring not just the food, but the moment, this fragile new peace they'd fought so hard to win. Gabriel told stories about school, making them all laugh with his impressions of his teacher. Margaret spoke cautiously of her plans to look for her own place, somewhere fresh to start over. "You know," Eleanor said, "this house has plenty of room for all of us." As the meal came to an end, the twilight deepened outside the windows. Fireflies began to flicker in the garden like earthbound stars. Eleanor felt a fullness in her heart she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of secrets and sorrows finally lifted. She reached for her water glass and raised it in the fading light. The others followed, even Gabriel with his small cup of milk. "To new beginnings," Eleanor whispered, her voice steady and sure. "To new beginnings," they echoed, the simple glasses chiming together like bells announcing a change in the wind. 3 days later, the old Whitmore estate hummed with life. Workers moved across the grounds like industrious ants, repairing the sagging porch steps, touching up peeling paint, and clearing decades of overgrowth from the flower beds. The sound of hammers and saws filled the morning air, breathing new life into a home that had stood frozen in time for too long. Maria, clipboard in hand, moved confidently among the workers, approving plans and making decisions with a natural authority that surprised even her. The funds she now controlled had transformed from an abstract number into a means of renewal. Gabriel darted between the workers, a self-appointed helper in blue overalls, and a too large hard hat that kept slipping over his eyes. "I got more nails, Mr. Jim," he called, struggling with a small bucket. "And Mommy says you can have lemonade when you get thirsty." Eleanor sat in her wicker chair on the portion of the porch not under construction, a light blanket across her knees despite the warm spring day. Her doctor had insisted on rest, but she couldn't bear to be inside while her home transformed around her. Her eyes followed Gabriel with quiet joy. "Don't get in the way, Gabriel," she called gently. "I'm helping, Grandma," he shouted back, beaming with pride. A car slowed on the street, and Eleanor recognized Betty Hargrove from church. She'd been one of the first to spread gossip after the scene with Charles. Now she sat in her car, watching the activity with undisguised curiosity. Eleanor raised her hand in a small wave. After a moment's hesitation, Betty drove through the open gates and parked. "Quite a project you've got going," Betty said, approaching the porch carefully. "It was long overdue," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the chair beside her. "Join me?" Betty sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap. "The whole town's talking about what happened in court." "I imagine they are." Betty faltered, then straightened her shoulders. "I owe you an apology, Eleanor. The things I said about Maria weren't fair or Christian." Eleanor's face softened. "We all make judgments with incomplete information, Betty. Still, I should have known better. You've always had good judgment." By noon, 3 more neighbors had stopped by, each with similar awkward apologies. Eleanor accepted each one with simple grace, offering lemonade and conversation without a hint of bitterness. Maria watched from the side garden, shaking her head in wonder. "How do you forgive so easily?" she asked Eleanor when they were alone. Eleanor smiled. "Holding grudges is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die." Besides, she looked toward Gabriel, who was now showing a worker's son how to make a whistle from a blade of grass. Life is too short and too precious. As afternoon melted into evening, the workers packed up their tools, but the estate remained alive with sound. Gabriel had invited 2 neighborhood children to play, and their laughter rang through the garden as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. Maria and Eleanor sat on the newly repaired porch steps, watching the children dart among the rose bushes. "I never thought I'd hear children laughing here again," Eleanor said softly. "Neither did I," Margaret added, joining them with a tray of iced tea. "This house was always so quiet when I was growing up." The sunset painted the sky in strokes of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the lawn. One of the children shrieked with delight as they caught a firefly, the tiny light glowing between cupped hands. "Make a wish before you let it go," Gabriel instructed solemnly. Eleanor closed her eyes, making her own silent wish, as the sound of children's laughter echoed through the garden, sweeter than any music she'd ever heard. Margaret sat at the lawyer's desk, pen hovering over the separation papers. Her hand trembled slightly as she stared at the empty signature line. "Take your time, Mrs. Whitmore," the lawyer said gently. The weight of 20 years pressed on her shoulders. 20 years of shrinking herself to fit Charles's expectations. 20 years of ignored intuition and swallowed words. She signed her name with unexpected steadiness. "I've filed everything with the court," the lawyer explained. "Mr. Whitmore will be served papers by tomorrow afternoon." Margaret nodded, feeling oddly light as she stepped out of the office into the spring sunshine. She drove straight to her mother's estate, where Eleanor waited on the front porch, hands folded in her lap. "I did it," Margaret said simply as she climbed the steps. Eleanor's face brightened with pride. She reached for Margaret's hand and squeezed it tight. "My brave girl." "I don't feel brave," Margaret admitted. "I feel terrified." "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it." They walked arm in arm into the house where Maria was arranging fresh flowers in the entryway. She looked up, her eyes asking the question before her lips formed the words. "It's done," Margaret confirmed. Maria smiled warmly. "I made your favorite lemon cake. I thought we might need something sweet today." Later, as they sat in the kitchen sharing cake and tea, Margaret unfolded a small notebook filled with lists and numbers. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she explained. "I found a small apartment in town, but the lease is for 6 months. That gives me time to figure out a more permanent plan." Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Maria. "You know you have a home here, if you want it. I couldn't impose." "Impose?" Eleanor laughed softly. "This house has 7 bedrooms and only 3 people. Gabriel keeps begging for a dog because he gets lost looking for all of us." Maria nodded. "He went missing for 20 minutes yesterday. Found him in the library, convinced he'd discovered a secret room." Margaret's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "You've already reorganized your lives. I don't want to disrupt that." "Family doesn't disrupt," Eleanor said firmly. "Family completes." Maria placed her hand over Margaret's. "There's the blue bedroom upstairs. It gets the morning Sunday. I aired it out last week, just in case." Margaret looked between them. These two women who had found strength in each other when the world tried to pit them against one another. "You knew I'd come back?" "We hoped," Eleanor said simply. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Margaret slipped outside. The moon cast silver light across the estate grounds, illuminating paths she'd run along as a child. The air smelled of jasmine and possibility. For so long, she'd measured her worth through Charles' eyes. His approval had been the sun she orbited around even as it burned her. Now that orbit was broken, and the vastness of her freedom both thrilled and terrified her. She walked to the old oak tree where her father had once hung a swing. The swing was long gone, but the massive tree remained solid and enduring. She placed her palm against its rough bark, feeling the life pulsing beneath. "What would you think of me now, Daddy?" she whispered. Then she straightened her shoulders, a smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "I'm free," she breathed into the night air. "I'm finally free." The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and roasting chicken as Eleanor and Maria worked side by side, their movements a familiar dance after decades in the same space. Yet something had shifted between them. The invisible line separating employer and employee had dissolved, leaving two women bound by something deeper than a paycheck. "Remember when I first hired you?" Eleanor asked, her hands deep in bread dough. "You were so young, barely 20. Maria laughed as she chopped vegetables. "And terrified. I broke that crystal vase your husband loved within my first week. And I told you it was ugly anyway," Eleanor finished with a smile. "I thought for sure you'd send me packing." Eleanor looked up, flour dusting her cheeks. "I knew then you were special, the way you apologized, with such dignity. Most people grovel or make excuses." Maria paused her chopping. "I needed the job so badly. Gabriel's father, well, Charles, was already married to Margaret by then, and I had nowhere else to go." A comfortable silence settled between them as they both acknowledged the painful truths they'd come to accept. "I never told you," Eleanor said softly. "But that first Christmas you worked here, when you put that small wrapped gift by my breakfast plate. The embroidered handkerchief," Maria remembered. "I stayed up 3 nights making it. No one had given me something handmade since Margaret was a little girl." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "That's when I knew you weren't just staff." Maria wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the older woman's shoulder. "For years I felt guilty, loving this family, loving you like a mother, when I carried such a secret." "We all have secrets," Eleanor said. "Some protect, some destroy. Yours protected Gabriel, gave him a chance at dignity. And now?" Maria gestured around them at the kitchen that was now legally hers. "Now we're what we were always meant to be. Family." They worked in companionable silence, sliding the bread into the oven, stirring the gravy, setting out the good china. Not for show or special occasion, but because every meal together now felt worth celebrating. "When my Eduardo died," Maria said suddenly, "leaving me alone and pregnant, I thought God had abandoned me, but he was leading me here all along." Eleanor nodded. "To this kitchen, to this home, to you," Maria said simply. They heard the front door open. and Gabriel's excited voice echoed through the house. He'd been out collecting pine cones with Margaret for the centerpiece. "Mom, Grandma, look how many we found." He burst into the kitchen, arms full of pine cones, Margaret following behind with an indulgent smile. "Careful with those near the food, young man," Maria cautioned, but her eyes were bright with love. "I'll help him arrange them," Margaret offered, her own face more relaxed than it had been in years. The separation papers had been finalized the previous week, and each day she stood taller, spoke more freely. Later, they gathered around the long dining table, sunshine streaming through the windows. Gabriel insisted on saying grace, his small hand gripping Eleanor's wrinkled one on his right, his mother's on his left, completing the circle with Margaret. "Thank you, God, for our food and our home, and for making us a family, even though we don't all have the same last name," he said earnestly. "And thank you that Mom doesn't have to wear a uniform anymore and can sit with us at dinner." Eleanor caught Maria's eye across the table, both women blinking back tears. Margaret reached over and squeezed her mother's free hand. The table that had once hosted formal dinners with invisible barriers between those who served and those who were served, now held 4 hearts beating as one, united not by obligation, but by choice, by love, by forgiveness, the strongest bonds of all. The bus pulled away from the curb, leaving a thin trail of exhaust in the morning air. Charles Whitmore stood at the station, a solitary figure with 2 expensive suitcases at his feet and nowhere that truly felt like home. His normally immaculate suit hung looser now, his face etched with new lines of bitterness. Half a block away, Margaret watched from her parked car. She hadn't planned to come, hadn't wanted to see him leave, yet something pulled her here. Not longing or regret, but a need for closure. The man boarding that bus was a stranger to her now, a man whose true face had been revealed too late. Charles picked up his luggage, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When he turned, he spotted her car. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. He straightened, summoning a final flash of the pride that had been his downfall. Margaret didn't wave, didn't nod. She simply watched, her heart steady and calm. He boarded without looking back. "Goodbye, Charles," she whispered to the empty car. The weight that had pressed on her chest for years lifted like morning fog. She started her engine and drove toward the estate, toward home. "Did you hear? Charles Whitmore lost everything, Mrs." Patterson whispered to her friend at the market, not noticing Eleanor examining tomatoes nearby. "The firm asked him to resign after the scandal. No one would hire him after what he did." "Karma," her friend replied, shaking her head, treating his mother-in-law that way, denying his own son. Eleanor pretended not to hear, selecting her produce with careful attention. But these conversations follow her everywhere now. At church, the pharmacy, the post office, the town that had once whispered about Maria now spoke of Eleanor with newfound respect. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," called Mr. Jenkins from behind the counter. "Those tomatoes are on the house today." Eleanor smiled, but shook her head. "Thank you, but I'll pay my way. Always have." "Strong woman," she heard him tell his assistant as she left. "Stood up against that bully when nobody else would." The admiration felt strange. Eleanor had never sought approval, had only done what felt right. The memory of Charles's face in court haunted her sometimes. The moment he realized he lost everything that mattered because he valued only things that didn't. That evening, Eleanor sat on the porch swing, watching Gabriel chase fireflies across the lawn. Maria and Margaret chatted in the kitchen, their laughter floating through open windows. The restored columns gleamed white in the fading light, the gardens bursting with new life. She thought of Charles boarding that bus, leaving behind not just a town, but the family he never truly appreciated. There was no triumph in his downfall, only sadness for what might have been if pride hadn't poisoned his heart. "Grandma, look," Gabriel called, his hands cupped around the glowing firefly. "Gentle now," she reminded him. "Everything that shines deserves freedom." The boy nodded solemnly and opened his hands. The tiny light hovered a moment before rising into the darkening sky. Eleanor closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. Not for revenge or punishment, those brought no joy, but gratitude that justice had come in its own quiet way. That truth had prevailed. That love had proven stronger than greed. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for showing us all a better path. Even Charles, someday. Especially Charles." The swing creaked gently as night fell around her, wrapping the healed family in its peaceful embrace. Golden leaves skittered across the sidewalk as Eleanor and Gabriel walked the 3 blocks to Oak Ridge Elementary. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples from nearby orchards. Eleanor held the boy's small hand in hers, matching her pace to his excited skips and hops. "Will they like me, Grandma?" Gabriel asked, his new backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Of course they will, sweetheart. Just be yourself, that wonderful, kind boy I love so much." Gabriel nodded seriously, as if memorizing important instructions. His brand new shoes clicked on the sidewalk, and he'd insisted on wearing the blue sweater Maria had knitted for him, despite the morning being barely cool enough to need it. "Are you nervous?" Eleanor asked. Gabriel considered this question carefully. "A little. But you said being brave isn't about not feeling scared." "That's right," Eleanor smiled. "Being brave means doing something even when you feel scared." They turned the corner, and the brick schoolhouse came into view. Children poured from cars and buses, their voices creating a cheerful symphony of shouts and laughter. Gabriel's steps slowed, but Eleanor felt his hand tighten around hers rather than pull away. "I'll be right beside you," she promised. The schoolyard bustled with activity. Parents hugged children goodbye, teachers directed traffic, and older students reunited with friends after summer break. Eleanor noticed a few curious glances their way. The town still remembered the courthouse drama, the scandal that had rocked their quiet community. But where there had once been judgment in those looks, Eleanor now saw something closer to respect. A small cluster of boys, Gabriel's age, played near the entrance. One waved, recognizing Gabriel from church. "That's Tommy," Gabriel whispered. "He has a pet turtle." "Why don't you go say hello?" Eleanor encouraged. Gabriel hesitated only a moment before approaching the group. Eleanor watched as the boys gathered around her grandson, curious about the newcomer. Her heart tightened with protective love, but she forced herself to stay back, giving him space to find his place. A bell rang, and a young teacher with a bright smile called the first graders to line up. Gabriel glanced back at Eleanor, then straightened his shoulders and joined the line. When the teacher began taking attendance, Eleanor moved closer. "Gabriel Lopez?" the teacher called. "Here." Gabriel raised his hand high. The teacher smiled. "Welcome to Oak Ridge, Gabriel. Would you like to introduce yourself to the class?" Gabriel stepped forward with surprising confidence. "I'm Gabriel. I live in the big white house with the oak trees with my mom and my grandma." He pointed toward Eleanor. "That's my grandma. She's teaching me to grow roses and play checkers." The simple introduction brought an unexpected lump to Eleanor's throat. After decades of being defined by her husband's name and wealth, then by Charles's cruel dismissal, she was now simply Grandma, the woman who grew roses and played checkers. Nothing had ever felt more valuable. Parents began dispersing as the children filed inside. Gabriel broke from the line to run back to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her waist in a fierce hug. "Bye, Grandma. I'll tell you everything after school." Eleanor bent down, adjusting his collar. "I'll be waiting right here when you're done." Gabriel rejoined his classmates, chattering excitedly with his new friends as they disappeared into the building. Eleanor stood watching long after the doors closed, tears of gratitude blurring her vision. She raised her hand in a final wave, though Gabriel could no longer see her. The motherhood she had known with Margaret had been precious, but this second chance, this unexpected gift of being a grandmother to a boy who needed her, filled the space in her heart she hadn't known was empty. Eleanor turned toward home, her step lighter than it had been in years. The porch swing creaked gently as Eleanor rocked back and forth, watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of amber and lavender. Margaret and Maria sat in wicker chairs facing her, each holding a steaming mug of tea. The evening air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle from the garden Gabriel had helped plant last month. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Margaret said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The months since the trial had softened her features, returning a sparkle to her eyes that Eleanor hadn't seen since Margaret was a young woman. "Sometimes I wake up and have to remind myself that I'm really here, that I'm free." Eleanor nodded, understanding her daughter's wonder. The grand old house that had once felt so empty now hummed with life. Through the open windows came the sound of Gabriel playing piano, his small fingers picking out a simple melody Maria had taught him. The estate hasn't felt this alive since your father was here, Eleanor said. I think he would be proud of what we've built. Maria smiled, her hands wrapped around her mug. I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream. To be back in the little cottage, worrying about how to pay Gabriel's school fees. No more worrying about that, Eleanor assured her. Though I must say, you've managed the estate accounts better than my Harold ever did. Maria laughed softly. I've always been good with numbers. Next spring, I want to renovate the east wing. Maybe turn it into a proper library for Gabriel. He reads everything he can get his hands on. He's so bright, Margaret agreed. Did you know he asked me to teach him French yesterday? Said he wants to read books from all over the world. The pride in Margaret's voice made Eleanor's heart swell. Her daughter had discovered a talent for teaching that she'd never explored during her years with Charles. Now she tutored Gabriel and was considering opening a small class for neighborhood children. And what about you, Margaret? Eleanor asked. Have you thought more about that teaching certificate? Margaret nodded. I start classes next month. At 52, I'll probably be the oldest student there, but I don't care. It's never too late to begin again, Eleanor said. The twilight deepened around them, and the first fireflies began to blink in the garden, tiny beacons of gold against the gathering darkness. Gabriel's piano playing stopped, and they heard his footsteps racing upstairs to bed. I look at him, Maria said softly, and I see a man who will grow up knowing he is loved. Not just by his mother, but by his grandmother and his aunt. He'll never doubt his worth the way. Her voice caught, the way I sometimes did. Eleanor reached out, taking Maria's hand in her right and Margaret's in her left. We've all been broken in different ways, she said. But look at us now healing together. Margaret squeezed her mother's hand. I never thought I'd find happiness again after everything with Charles, but I've never felt more at peace than I do right now, on this porch, with both of you. The three women fell silent, their joined hands forming a circle of strength and trust. Above them, stars emerged one by one, steady points of light in the vast darkness. Eleanor closed her eyes, offering a prayer of gratitude for this unlikely family bound, not by obligation or blood alone, but by choice and love. Fireflies danced around them, their gentle light blessing the silent prayer of three women who had found, at last, the meaning of home. Sunlight spilled across the porch on a perfect spring morning, warming Eleanor's shoulders as she rocked gently in her favorite chair. The estate gardens had burst into color overnight, as if nature itself celebrated their newfound peace. Grandma Eleanor, look what I found! Gabriel bounded up the porch steps, his small hands clutching a bunch of wildflowers, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and sprigs of Queen Anne's lace tied with a piece of grass. His cheeks were flushed with excitement, dark eyes sparkling. Why? They're absolutely beautiful. Eleanor accepted the bouquet, breathing in their subtle fragrance. At 8 years old, Gabriel had grown taller over these past months, but his heart remained just as pure. Maria followed her son up the steps, carrying a tray with lemonade and cookies. He was up at dawn, determined to pick the perfect flowers. Margaret appeared from inside, carrying an extra cushion for her mother. I told him you'd prefer wildflowers to anything from a store. You know me well. Eleanor smiled as her daughter tucked the cushion behind her back. She looked at the three faces surrounding her, her chosen family, and felt a fullness in her heart that no amount of money in her accounts had ever provided. Gabriel climbed onto the bench beside Eleanor, leaning against her arm. Miss Hawkins at school says we should listen to old people because they know important stuff. Do you know important stuff, Grandma? Maria gasped. Gabriel! That's not polite. Eleanor laughed, a sound that came easier these days. No, he's right to ask. She patted the boy's hand. I've had 78 years to learn a few things, I suppose. She gazed out over the estate grounds, where daffodils nodded in the gentle breeze. I've learned that the numbers in the bank account don't matter much in the end. What matters is who sits beside you when you're hurting, who remembers how you take your tea, who calls just to hear your voice. Margaret settled into a chair, her eyes soft with understanding. I spent so many years thinking wealth was something you counted. Eleanor touched the simple gold band she still wore 18 years after Harold's passing. But true abundance isn't in what you have, it's in what you give away. Forgiveness, time, love. Maria wiped a tear from her cheek. You gave us so much more than this estate. And you gave me a family when mine was broken, Eleanor replied. That's worth more than $18 million could ever be. Gabriel, solemn now, took Eleanor's weathered hand in his small one. I'm glad you're my grandma. So am I, sweetheart. Eleanor squeezed his fingers gently. So am I. The morning light strengthened, casting long, golden rays across the lawn. In the kitchen window, Eleanor could see the staff preparing breakfast not as servants but as part of their extended household. Through the open doors came the sound of the radio playing softly, and someone's laughter floating from upstairs. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the presence of those she loved around her. This moment, this peace, this was what mattered. This, she whispered, as the sun rose fully over the estate that had once felt so empty and now overflowed with life. This is the legacy I leave behind. Beyond the porch, beyond the gardens and the trees, life continued its steady rhythm. Birds called to one another, neighbors waved as they passed down the road, and within the walls of the old house, a family bound by choice rather than obligation found their place in the world together. If you enjoyed the story of Eleanor Whitmore, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.